other people. So we'll start the recording. Welcome back, everybody. We are starting a new unit called, well, the unit only lasts for 2 class periods, so it's not much of a unit, but power distribution issues. And then we're going to get into economic issues. Really, the whole rest of the semester is we're just looking at public policy issues. And this first couple days worth, tonight and then Friday, seems sort of like political theory, but it's just foundational stuff. As we look into the particular different subject areas of economic, and then a variety of domestic policy issues, and then finally foreign policy issues. I like the idea of covering power distribution as debatable topics because we don't all agree on them in terms of, do we prioritize liberty or do we prioritize, equality or whatever. So we actually are into the issues category, and the way I'm doing it here is we're going to have 3 more tests. The third test is coming up. Let's see here. Third test is coming up a week and a half from now, so it's a week from Friday. We'll have the third test, and that'll be over what we covered tonight, what we cover Friday, what we cover next Wednesday, and then also what we cover next Friday, and then we'll take the test at the end of class. So the tests are coming fast and furious for us. And speaking of tests, we took one last Friday, right? Was that my imagination? You took a test Friday, right? Yeah, you remember doing that?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. And I don't have that graded. I would have done it on, I probably would have got the results back on Monday. Lately, I've been coming in, driving down to Des Moines later on Mondays, but this week I had to leave at 8 in the morning, and it wasn't graded yet. So I'll just have to hand the test back on Friday, and we'll go over it. The other thing that I should just say is that we do not have a book that we're going to be going through for the rest of the semester. So we're not exactly flying blind, but unlike the very book intensive first portion of the course, the rest of the course is not going to be that way. We focused on the Bible a little bit on this last test, but now we're going to be focusing on different issues. And I would encourage you to still take notes, and I'll still hand out before the next test the outlines and the PowerPoint slides that I'm using as I'm sharing information, but it's going to be a little bit different because we don't have any book to refer to. Let's see, having said all that, I've got like 7 minutes after 9, so I think we're just going to go ahead and get going. Let me make this full screen. We're going to share a screen. This is going to be our last unit of material where I use PowerPoint slides. I'll be sad to see them go, not really, but sometimes I think they're more trouble than they're worth. But you may recall that for the first unit, I used water droplets as the template, and then I used plywood, and now we're up to, I don't know what, a strip of green for some reason, maybe because spring is coming. It was 64 in Des Moines today. I don't suppose it was that warm up in Sioux Center, right? But yeah, it's supposed to be 70 in Des Moines on Monday. So
it was really nice today.
Was it nice? Yeah. Yeah. Even in the 50s, it would be really nice for a February, right? And I did I apologize if this we could talk about this issue more when we get into the environment. I apologize for making light of what may or may not be a serious problem. But I did think the other day, it's like if this is global warming, keep it coming. I hate winter, and I specifically I hate cold. And so I don't know whether this has anything to do with climate change or not, but I'm not complaining when we have a winter full of 40s and 50s, maybe 60s. Um, all right. So tonight we're going to be focusing on um, liberty. And liberty, the way I use the word, it's synonymous with freedom. All right, so liberty, freedom, same thing. And when I think about, sorry, let me get my notes in a row here. When I think about liberty or freedom, this is something that's very American. I mean, it goes back to the very beginning. When we think about the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War, that's also called the War for the War for Independence. And the whole idea of breaking away from Great Britain and wanting to make the decisions for ourselves as Americans, being tired of being a colony, wanting to be an independent, sovereign, free nation. I mean, that's there from the very beginning, right? Liberty, that shows up, if you study the American Revolution, that shows up during that period of the 1760s, 1770s, throughout. They had liberty trees, they had liberty poles, they had the Sons of Liberty was the name of the group that Sam Adams in Boston organized. They did the Boston Tea Party, that was his group. It wasn't just the idea of like lower taxes. You know, they complained about high taxes, but in the end, the crux of the matter for Americans, at least those Americans who wanted to be independent, it went beyond that. It was the idea of no taxation without representation. And in the end, the more they got dissatisfied with British imperial or colonial rule, the more radical they became in their thinking. And they decided, even if we have representation, we don't want taxation from a foreign, body or a king thousands of miles away across the ocean. We want to make decisions for ourselves, even if we have to be taxed. We not only want to vote for them, but we want them closer to us. So this idea of distant foreign rule and being treated, as colonies in a kind of a second-class way, it rubbed them the wrong way, and they wanted to get out from under the thumb of Great Britain. And so that's where that liberty slogan became such an important part of what they were trying to do. I'm keeping an eye on participants just in case anybody's joining us late every so often, but I don't see anybody. So we will go back to our slide here. When we think about patriotic songs for the United States, one of the most famous songs is America, or we also call it My Country 'Tis of Thee. And one of the stanzas that we don't always sing, but it's eloquent. It's on the screen there. Our Father's God to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. So my question here is, this is poetry, but is this also truth? I mean, is this accurate? Is God the author of liberty? Can he be correctly or justly called the author of liberty? So what do you think about that question? Somebody take a swing at giving me your opinion. Is God the author of liberty? Or if not, who is? Bree, what do you think? Now that I can see all your squares, even if I can't see your faces, Bree, what would you say to that? Is God the author of liberty?
Um, I don't know. I was like pondering it because I don't really know if I have like a good answer to that question. I think it's interesting, like especially from like a reformed perspective, when you consider like the debate between like Calvinism and Arminianism. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can trace some levels of freedom. I mean, like back to the garden, like Eve had autonomy. So, I mean, I think you could say like, yeah, God is the author of liberty, but to what extent do we have liberty is kind of another question.
Mhm. Well,
So
good
I
point. If and if we weren't at a reformed college, a Calvinist or semi-Calvinist context, maybe that wouldn't come up. But you're right with predestination and that idea of God's sovereignty, which is very much a Calvinist or Reformed emphasis. Um, it does call into question that, right, a little bit at least. And yet somehow it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like the Trinity, where there's a paradox going on where, is God one? Is God three? Well, there is only one God, right? And yet in some sense, God is also three persons. So somehow you've got these two truths that coexist, even though it's sometimes difficult for us to understand how those two things can both be true. I mean, I know there's simple analogies and all of that to try to explain the Trinity, but but it's a deep kind of a truth, right? Um, well, who else? Who else wants to take a crack at that? But those are good points, Bree. Anybody else have a thought? Like, where did liberty come from? If it didn't come from God, where did it come from? And if God is the author of liberty, in other words, the creator of it, is that anything in Scripture that would indicate that that's true, or any examples of that from the Bible you can think of?
Maybe you could say that people who were created with complete liberty, um, and that it was only through eating the fruit and learning about what good and evil was by committing the first act of evil that there began to be real restrictions on what could be done because now people know what's good and what's bad. And because of that, the uh, realm of what should be done is bracketed in more.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Good point. And sin brings a lot of different things into the world. No, death is one result, spiritual death, right? And physical death, probably also. I guess we don't know for sure, but if Adam and Eve had never sinned, would they have lived forever, in their physical bodies on earth? Um, Probably, I guess speculation, but certainly spiritual death resulted, and eventually they died physically also. Um, but another result of sin tends to be bondage, right? And this is a very much a New Testament concept. Paul talks a lot about it in Romans and other places, talking about being in bondage or enslaved to sin, being mastered by sin. And even, I mean, we know that's true theologically, but even in our own lives, there's certain things that may start off good, but then because we're fallible, sinful people, um, it's hard for us to keep things, to do things in moderation. So even good things can become addictive, can take over our lives. We're free to do this stuff, but at the same time, even as we're free to do stuff, at a certain point, it can become, habitual or addictive, and it takes up a disproportionate amount of time and energy, and all of that in our lives, right? So we can kind of become in bondage to these things. And that's aside from the bad stuff, but even the good stuff can get out of balance like that. So here's my thought, and I know Bree, you made a good point about predestination, but I would make, this is my view, at least my opinion. I think God is the author of liberty. I think we can accurately describe him that way. And so, and the reason is twofold. First of all, when you think about God, as I was going to say as a person, but speaking of the Trinity, we can speak of God as three persons. But when we think about God as an entity, he has a lot of different traits or attributes, and he's all knowing, omniscient. He's all powerful, omnipotent. All of these different traits mean, I believe, that God is completely free. He is in charge of everything as the creator of everything in the universe, or all the universes, if there's more than one. Everything flows from him. He's always been, he'll always be. He's more powerful than anything else in existence. No one can force him to do anything. To me, he's the embodiment of freedom or liberty. He's the embodiment of lots of things: love, truth, justice, all the good things in the world. God embodies those things. But I think freedom or liberty is one of the things that he embodies. He can't be controlled. He can do whatever he wants. He's completely free. Now, he may set boundaries for himself. He may make promises or covenants that he follows through, but even all of that is on his own terms, right? And he's following through because that's who God is, and he's true to himself. He's not obligated by any outside person or force or being or circumstance. He's free to do what he wishes. So in that way, I think he's the author of liberty. It comes from him. He's created it, and we see it in God himself. But then the second thing is, and this isn't found in the book of Genesis right away, but it plays out later on throughout the rest of the Bible. God gave us free will. And since I'm saying that the word freedom is a synonym for liberty, you basically, free will is the ability of human beings to have liberty. And it's a gift that he gave to human beings. And I think it's one of the ways that we are made in the image of God. This is a whole nother subject that we can't get into, but it's too theological. This isn't a theology class, but what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, does God have two eyes? Does he have two ears? Does he have hands and feet? Is he no, I don't think so. I mean, we sometimes picture him that way because it's hard for us to imagine him any other way other than some figure sitting on a throne and in the sky, and he must resemble us in some ways. But I don't think that's what it means to be made in the image of God. I think it's certain attributes of God that we have in very imperfect, especially after sin, but in imperfect or much diminished on a super small scale in comparison to God's infinite possession of these different attributes. But I think liberty is one of them, or free will. God has free will, and he has shared that with us. And that's one of the things that, along with our minds and our ability to, to exercise that will informed with our minds rather than, mainly by instinct and things like that, that the other creatures, animals and such, would be more inclined to do. Part of it is the ability to make decisions and do what we want. And of course, then that leads to what Bree brought up. I think Adam and Eve were free in the garden, not just in terms of human government, which is a type of freedom, but even more importantly, they were free to make their own decisions, even to the point of disobeying God, right? And you think about all the stuff that's happened in the world since the fall, that could have been avoided if God had just created us as, puppets or robots or, pre-programmed entities that always did what he wanted. I mean, in many ways, the world would be, infinitely better if we were all just doing what God wanted at all times. But I think it's part of the price we pay for him allowing us to be free. With free will, we can make good decisions or bad decisions, but that was what he wanted. He didn't want just something that he would control. He wanted to share the ability to be free with us. So does that spark any feedback from anybody or thoughts or disagreement?
I guess I've kind of thought about this kind of idea too. And I guess my question to you would be, yeah, God wanted this relationship with us, so he gave us this free will. Does that make God selfish? Because like you said, if we were just automatons, perhaps the world would be better. So is God selfish for wanting a relationship over perhaps the greater good?
Yeah, you are like a philosopher, aren't you, Trigby?
Perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. I'd have to think about that one. I hate to
Yeah,
selfish off the top of my head without thinking that one through for a while.
yeah.
But perhaps. But I do feel like if anybody has a right to be selfish, it's God. I feel like as the embodiment of truth and justice and freedom and rationality and goodness and all of that stuff. I feel like yeah, he's got a right to be selfish if he wants to. I don't know if that's, but even there, I think there's a paradox because I think he's also selfless because it's like he's also sharing all of these attributes with us as human beings, even though he knows ahead of time that many, probably most of the people that he endows with free will aren't going to follow him, aren't going to recognize him, aren't going to do things that are pleasing, things that we end up doing things, even those of us who do know him, we end up doing things all the time that hurt him and make him sad and make him angry and all those different things. So in that way, he's also kind of selfless. So you probably have a point there. But yeah, I don't know. That's the answer off the top of my head. Yeah, I was just skimming the surface of philosophy. You took a deep dive there. Anyone else have a thought on that? God and freedom? Well, let me go on. I'm going to go on to let's see here. My next point here. Well, before I go to that slide, let me all right, here. Yeah, I'll say my little story before I show that slide. When I first started working at Dordt back in 2011, one of the first year I was just getting to know all the political science students. There were only like 5 or 6 of them. There weren't very many. But of the ones that were here that first year, I remember one of them was telling me about the previous professor who was transitioning out of Dordt at the time that I was replacing him. They were saying how in class they had brought up something, some kind of a point about that they were a libertarian, and he shot him down in discussion and said, Christians can't be libertarians. Libertarianism is unchristian. And then I laughed when I heard it. I said, really? He said that? I mean, first of all, not only does that seem rather harsh to say for a professor to say to a student in front of a class, but I said, well, it's also ludicrous. I mean, to say that a Christian can't be a libertarian. It struck me as odd. Now, where the professor was coming from, he was a Democrat, a progressive Democrat who emphasized things like social justice. And to him, libertarians were selfish, were uncaring for the poor and for the oppressed. And, you know, it was just very much a me first kind of approach, and didn't believe in using government to help people. That kind of thing. And so, you know, that was his image of libertarianism. Now, there's some truth to that, at least for some people who are libertarians, but seemed to me like that was a rather glib response and an inaccurate response in describing people who are libertarians, especially Christian libertarians. So here is, I think this is language I borrowed from somebody. I can't remember who, but at some point early on, when I was at Dordt, I was emailing back and forth with somebody, and they were asking me about my view of libertarianism and Christianity. And so, not liking to waste things, I recycle a lot of my things I write. So let me show the whole. Let me show the whole slide here. And let me hide everybody else. Okay, so this is what I wrote, and I think I still believe it. Let me read through it here. Many elements of libertarian thought are not only compatible with Christianity, but inherent parts of our faith, starting with God's decision to bestow free will on human beings. There are threads running through Scripture dealing with the value of liberty and the danger of power, and specifically the danger of human power, not so much the danger of God's power. These should be recognized. I do believe that our political philosophy should be more than libertarianism, or it will be lopsided and incomplete. Yes, there is liberty, but there is also responsibility. There is the individual, which libertarians tend to emphasize, but there is also the community. They complement one another. In other words, they fit together, and the various components all need to be taken into account as best we can, right? Oh yes, I think that's good. I still agree with that. Now, by libertarianism, I should define this. I mean, this is an ideology of people who prioritize liberty or freedom above other values. And so, you know, they may recognize that, yes, equality has some merit, justice has some merit, community has some merit, morality has some merit. But even so, in the end, liberty is the most important thing of all. And that tends to trump or tends to take priority in their minds over these other values that, you know, most Americans believe. So that's the number one value. And so when it comes to government and public policy and you know, controversial issues and things like that, they want to maximize liberty. So having said that, let me move on to my next slide here. Oopsie. Yes. I also say this, God created us with free will. He limits government because he does not want government to usurp his role in our lives. Even when bad choices are made, if they don't harm others, they need to be legal. someday each of us will answer to God for the choices we make. We don't necessarily have to answer to government. Now, if the bad choices we are making are harming other people, then I think government has a right and a responsibility to step in to, prevent us, or if they are not able to prevent us, at least to warn us that if we do these things that are harmful to others, if we're caught and we're convicted, we'll be punished, right? God has given human beings free will. He does not use coercion to achieve what he desires. This argument acknowledges that God will ultimately act as a judge in dispensing rewards and punishments, but he is willing to wait until the end of a person's life on earth and does not use his almighty power in a coercive manner. But human government is not like this. It is based on force. Human government does not appeal to the mind, heart, or conscience of individuals and then respect their choices, even if it disagrees. Oh yeah, I see here. Oops, sorry, let's go back here. So what I want to do, I'm going to stop the share for a minute. Now the government may appeal to our heart, mind, and conscience, and it does oftentimes. It will try to convince us to do the right thing. It will encourage us, right? But in the end, it relies on force or coercion if we choose not to follow it. Because really, the most important incentive for government, in not all cases, but in many cases, is the threat of punishment. If we don't obey, and they don't have to say that constantly, because we kind of know if something is a law, we're expected to follow it, even if we don't like it, even if we've thought it through and say, yeah, all things considered, and no, I really believe that I should go 80 miles an hour rather than 55 on this highway. Well, you can decide that for yourself, but if you get caught, the judge or the jury, they're not going to be swayed, and neither will the police if you decide that you're not going to pay your fine and all of that. Eventually they will lead you away, and with the threat of firearms, saying that we are empowered to enforce this law, and we're going to do it whether you agree with it mentally or not, right? God's willing to bide his time. Doesn't mean that people who do horrible things aren't someday going to pay or answer for what they do, but he's willing to bide his time. The government, not so much. Any thoughts about any of that, or the more, the earlier kind of broad question about libertarianism and Christianity? Do you find the two seem incompatible, or how would you express the relationship between the Christian faith and an ideology that prioritizes liberty over other values?
It was brought up in a college Republicans meeting that Ayn Rand, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yep, Ayn Rand, yep.
Her version of libertarian thought, she's not Christian, it's an explicitly unchristian ideology in that way. But I think it's obvious that there are many American libertarian Christians, and that it's not a contradictory ideology. But if the highest good is personal self-expression, then that can be the definition of sin, to say that it's my choices, not God's choices, that are the most important.
Yeah. I agree. And you mentioned Ayn Rand, who's famous for various books. Atlas Shrugged is her most famous, I suppose. She was an atheist, and somebody who rejected the idea of God, or didn't recognize his existence. And her philosophy of objectivism was, I think, inherently a glorification of selfishness. I mean, it's a type of individualism that really either doesn't recognize any merit to the idea of community, or at least puts it, community in relation to individuals, it puts it so far back in terms of the ranking that really it's irrelevant. To her, the community trying to for the individual to have to keep in mind like obligations to other people, whether it's family or friends or your neighbor or that kind of thing. That was part of the oppression that we were supposed to reject. And not just politically, but even mentally, psychologically, she saw that as a trap, and so very much emphasized egoism or selfishness or self-centeredness, whatever word you want to use, even to the point where something like altruism, of helping people even though you get nothing in return, which is what altruism is. To her, it was irrational. It was self-defeating. It's fine to help people, but do it because you want to, because it's going to do something for you. That's the important thing. And if everybody was driven by this sort of self-centeredness, somehow everything, we would all be happy, and it would all work out so well. Of course, I think there's some flaws with that thinking, because it's also going to lead to a lot of conflict. But she was not big on obligations, social obligations, or obligations to others. It was really all very me-centered. That kind of libertarianism I don't agree with, and I don't think is Christian. And it's not surprising that it comes from a person who's an atheist, because she's taking a big chunk of Christianity, which is love for your neighbor, and she's taking that away, right? So any kind of selflessness, and certainly like Jesus coming to earth and dying on the cross. I mean, that's like an ultimate example of selflessness. All of that gets taken away. So she doesn't recognize any of that. So it doesn't mean that, Atlas Shrugged, is a bad book, or that she doesn't have a lot of important, valuable insights that we can learn from her. I think there are. I spent a whole semester, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, with a political science student doing an individual study where he went through and walked me through Atlas Shrugged chapter by chapter, so I learned a lot, and it sounds like a really interesting book, probably an important book to read at some point. But the underlying philosophy of Ayn Rand, I don't think it's particularly Christian. Any other thoughts on that idea of libertarianism? Have you ever heard that argument before, that you can't really be a good Christian if you're a libertarian, or there's something suspect about it from a Christian point of view? I guess my argument is there are certain elements of libertarianism that are very compatible with Christianity. It's just that I don't think it's the whole story. I think if that's all that you're emphasizing is liberty and the individual rights, if that's all you've got going, I think you've missed important parts of the story. So you maybe have a quarter or something like that of the story, but to take that quarter and say that's everything, I think that's sketchy, because that's not what I see in Scripture. I see more of a balance and a lot of different things that are very important in addition to liberty. Let me go back to share screen, and let's go back to PowerPoint here. If we think about some of the other things in Scripture that relate to freedom and liberty, you have the phrase that Moses expresses to Pharaoh in the book of Exodus when he wants to get his people out of bondage, out of slavery, and lead them out of Egypt into the promised land, which is not only a leaving of slavery in Egypt, but it's a type of freedom. It's a type of independence, right? Of finding their own place. They can set their own rules, live their lives the way they want, follow their own God. And so what does he say? He says, "Let my people go," and that even though the word Exodus is putting an emphasis on the journey from slavery into freedom, the destination and the process of getting out from under slavery is implied by that phrase. And that serves as an example not only to Jews historically through the millennia, but it also has served as an example for African Americans and other oppressed people too. But specifically, I'm thinking of the slaves, and then the descendants of slaves in the United States. That phrase, "Let my people go," and even the African American spiritual "Go down, Moses." They identified with those stories in the Bible long before they were able to read the words for themselves. They would hear the stories from the Bible, and they instinctively identified with the Jews because they were slaves also, right? And so even then on through the 1950s, 1960s, the more modern civil rights movement, you still see these images of God setting his people free because they were slaves, and a certain identification with that. Let's see here. Sorry, it takes me so long to do all of this, but I'm trying to find, how do I make my slide not full screen again? There's got to be a way, right? Can anybody talk? I can't see you at the moment, but anybody know how you get back to not full screen?
Do you have an escape button?
Yes, I'm pushing my escape button. That does not do it. That's a good idea. Let's see. Well, that's okay. I'll make do. If we fast forward from the Old Testament into the New Testament, very early on in Luke chapter 4, this isn't too long after those early chapters of the nativity, the what we call the Christmas story today. You see Jesus reading from the book of Isaiah in his synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, right? And he quotes, oh, I still have my Bible with me, so let me just actually quote the book of Luke, as long as I've got it. He quotes from Isaiah in Luke chapter 4. It records Jesus as opened the book or opens a scroll, and he quotes Isaiah saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." He closes the book and maybe it was a book, maybe it was a scroll, hard to say if this is translated correctly. He gives it back to the attendant and he sat down, and the eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him, and then he begins to say, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So he identifies with this prophecy that Isaiah wrote down when he was inspired by the Spirit of God. And he's saying, I am the Messiah, and this is what I'm here to do. I'm going to preach good news to the poor. That's good news is another way of saying the gospel. But I'm also going to release the captives. I'm going to set at liberty those who are oppressed. So the setting free here, on the one hand, there's a spiritual element to it, right? He's going to preach good news, but it says to the poor. It isn't just, to people in general. Here it's specific to the poor. Now, is that the spiritually poor? Is that the materially poor? It doesn't really say. He's going to set the captives free. Does he mean like people who are literally in prison or jail? Or does he mean those who are spiritually captive to sin or to the devil, right? The setting of free, it doesn't really, you can interpret these words different ways. Even poor doesn't necessarily mean poor in terms of money or wealth, because, in the Beatitudes, one book talks about blessed are the poor, another one says blessed are the poor in spirit. So there can be a spiritual kind of poverty that he could be talking about. So the question is the setting free, is this physical and political? Is it that kind of setting free? Or is it spiritual or theological that he's talking about? And when we think about this question, there are different kinds of bondage that he could be referring to. In terms of physical bondage, if that's what Jesus was here to do, and if that's what, as Christians, we're supposed to be following his example, we could be working on changing unjust social structures. We could create new laws, or maybe even have a revolution. If the government is oppressive, maybe it's time to overthrow the government. Now, that could be, there could be different types of revolutions. There could be something like the American Revolution, or in more recent times, it could be, Marxist, socialist, communists overthrowing a right-wing fascist dictatorship. It could be that kind of revolution. Or in the eyes of some, even the United States has reached the point where maybe we need to have a revolution before too long, where, God-fearing, patriotic Americans rise up and overthrow the dictatorship of the totalitarian left, the cult of wokeness and the godless un-American people who are destroying our country, right? You hear that argument. So whether you're approaching the subject from the left or from the right, maybe you could argue that this is an example that Jesus set, and this is something that we should follow. Freeing people from physical bondage. On the other hand, if we're talking about spiritual bondage, here the solutions to that might be things like evangelism. We're going to preach the gospel, discipleship. We teach people. We set an example for other people. Fellowship, like going to church. In some ways, these seem a little more pedestrian and less exciting, at least than a revolution, a political revolution. But these would be the more fitting responses. For the physical bondage, I mentioned liberation theology, and we're not going to go into detail in this class. In modern political thought, we spend a little bit more time on it, but essentially this is something that came out of Roman Catholic teachings, specifically in Latin America, and then later on it spread outside the Catholic Church to other places, including the United States. And you got Black liberation theology, and James Cone and others in the United States, African-American theologians, who really approached it from a socialist point of view. And at times they were even willing to use violence in promoting political revolution if that was necessary. But liberation theology it believes that Jesus came to deliver people from material bondage and from political bondage. So in other words, oppression by the capitalist class that exploits the labor of people, but then also political oppression of people who don't respect human rights and, you know, the dignity of every person and all of that. So for them, liberation is something that comes from God, but they see it being fulfilled in a way in our day by kind of a mixture between Christianity and socialism, and more specifically, Marxism. Really Karl Marx, who, although he was an atheist, they're kind of trying to combine these two things into what they call liberation theology. What would you say about that? I'm going to stop sharing. I've got one more slide after this as we wind things down, but you know, when Jesus is talking about that, you know, here I am, he's going to preach good news to the poor, he's going to release the captives, he's going to recover the sight to the blind. Does he mean the people who can't actually see, you know, physically blind, or is he talking about spiritually blind? And same thing with those, he's going to set at liberty those who are oppressed. I mean, that's the key line of all of these. He's going to set the oppressed free. He's going to give them liberty. What kind of oppression do you think is he talking about? Is it just spiritual? Or is it just physical oppression? Or is it both? And how do we know?
I guess I would say it's kind of both. I think he can't remember where, but he kind of accuses the Pharisees of being blind themselves.
Mhm.
But he
Yeah.
actually doesn't really help the Pharisees, but he actually helps people that are physically blind. And then
True. True.
and then also he doesn't really do any jailbreaks, but he, like, I guess through like dying on the cross gives a spiritual way out, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. A good point. He doesn't break people out of jail, but it is interesting, right? I mean,
I guess he did free Barabbas in a way. Yeah.
well, that's true. He's connected at least.
Yeah.
Well, and the thief on the cross, I mean, he didn't set him free, but
Oh yeah.
from the cross, right? But he did promise him, you know, that he would be with him in paradise, right? So it is kind of interesting. You brought up the blind thing. That's right. I mean, he actually literally makes blind people see, or helps them to see, or causes them to see through his miracles. But then also, no, and this has got to be either quoted by Jesus or someone in the Gospels, that Old Testament passage about the people who, you know, were in darkness have seen a great light. I mean, that's got to be somewhere in the New Testament, right? Otherwise, I don't think I would know it, that verse. But I mean, clearly, he's also giving a spiritual sight to people who are spiritually blind through his teaching when it comes to earth. So but it has a component. I mean, he does seem to seek out those who, you know, whether they're in jail literally for committing some kind of crime, but people who are outcasts, you know, even the tax collectors who are seen as traitors and sellouts and, you know, oppressors, working Jews who were working with the Romans, that group, but you know, prostitutes, people who are not socially respectable. He is willing to hang out with them and treat them with respect, in a way that scandalized, you know, the Pharisees, that, you know, he's hanging out with people who are, you know, drunkards and doing all these things, kind of the seedy people of society, or those that lepers and people like that the respectable people wouldn't be seen with, right, or hang out with, and yet he was willing to hang out with them. So I guess my answer, since we're running out of time here, is I think it encompasses both. I don't think we have to choose between liberation theology, or, well, put it this way, between physical material liberation and spiritual liberation. they don't always go together. And I personally, I'm not a liberation theology person. I don't think we need to go to Karl Marx for wisdom as to how we should be good Christians. I think the Bible is full of lots of wisdom and insights and precepts. We don't have to turn to Karl Marx. And if I was going to turn to a socialist, it wouldn't be Marx. There are anarchist socialists of the 1800s that were contemporaries that I think were a lot wiser and more humane than Marx. But I think there is some truth to that. And sometimes Christians can react against that to the point where, we mock people who are social justice warriors, SJWs. But, I think God, he does care about justice. We know that. And if we're talking about justice on a large scale, you can call that social justice. So if I'm not embarrassed to say I believe in social justice, and I think we have an obligation to work for social justice. Now, what that means, in practical terms, in terms of, laws and public policy, we can debate that. We don't all agree, but I do think God does want us to care about justice, as well as the spiritual aspect. So I don't think we have to have this reductionistic kind of thing or dualistic view of here's the spiritual kinds of stuff we should care about, and then here's the physical, political, material stuff. We can ignore all that as long as we emphasize the spiritual. I think God cares about all of it. And there's different opportunities for us to work on that. I'm going to show you the last slide real quick. And then we will, okay, here I am. So I don't take up my whole screen. I just had to open up the other aspect. So let me move on to the last slide, which is this. Here's a good quote from Jesus. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. I'm not going to go into detail on this one at 8:01, other than just to say it's something to ponder. What's the relationship between truth and freedom? My really simple-minded response to that is that I think because God is the embodiment of truth, he is truth, Jesus is truth himself, God is truth, but God is also freedom. God embodies these things just like he embodies the justice and righteousness and so many, everything good, beauty, God embodies it all. I think in a way there's synonyms, but how that would play out, maybe this is a question for those of you who want to think philosophically. What's the relationship between truth and freedom? There's got to be some relationship there beyond, this is who God is. But what that is, I haven't thought it through beyond just having the quote here. It's something to ponder. The other thing I wanted to point out is that Paul, I talked about freedom from sin, how it puts us into bondage. Romans 8:2, the whole chapter of Romans, chapter 8, deals with this, about how we are in bondage, we are enslaved by sin, and God can give us freedom. Galatians is another book that Paul wrote, which is sometimes referred to as the Magna Carta of Christian liberty. This isn't so much talking about bondage to sin, it's really bondage to the law, and the idea that we do not have to follow the law the way the Old Testament Jews followed it. It doesn't mean the law is bad, it doesn't mean it doesn't serve a purpose, but there is a difference under the new covenant in the New Testament, how we are moved from the realm of law to the realm of freedom through grace and through the Spirit. And so I think that's something on a spiritual level we should think about. And then the last point I want to make real quick is Abraham Kuyper wrote a great essay or speech back in the late 1800s called Uniformity, the Curse of Modern Life. And it's probably, it's in a compilation I have of Kuyper's writings, but you could probably find it online if you Google Uniformity, the Curse of Modern Life. And in opposition to that, Kuyper advocated what he called multiformity, or sometimes it could be called pluriformity. It's this idea that there should be diversity, and this is connected to his belief in liberty, that he did not want government to force everybody to do the exact same thing within a country, especially a diverse and large country. And that's why he believed in local government as much as possible, decentralized control, because he believed that this idea of trying to force everybody to be the same, well, he called it a curse, right? And that has political implications. Now, to some extent, you want to have some kind of order in a society. You want to have people on the same page. But he did not, he was very suspicious of people who wanted to enforce order on all of us and make us all the same, believing that went against, really the principles of God as found in Scripture. And he makes a very eloquent case for it in that essay about uniformity. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to get back so I can see you to say goodbye. And thanks for staying with us an extra 5 minutes. It always takes us a little bit of time to get going because we want to wait for as many people as possible to join us. But that's all I have to say tonight. As I said, I'll have your tests hopefully graded by Friday, and I'll give you those back in class. And hope you have a good rest of your night and a good rest of your week. All right.
Bye.
So goodbye, everybody. If you have anything else you want to say or add or you're wondering about, shoot me an email. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.